Blasphemy, which almost ruined a cult relic. An artifact that united Ukrainian intelligentsia around itself. Imperial habits that have not disappeared after 100 years. The Mykolayiv Regional Museum of Local Lore. More than 100 years ago, the museum's exposition included many samples of minerals, stuffed birds, fish, corals, sponges, and the herbaria of tropical plants. Today it brings together 5 museums in different spheres. There are plans to build the first Ukrainian Oxbridge, a museum complex within the entire quarter. Local Mykolayiv limestone. It was widely used by different tribes and people for domestic purposes, including making tombstones and certain works of art. Indeed, a 1.2 meter high and 27 centimeter thick stela was made from limestone. In all likelihood, it was slightly larger. Perhaps it was 20 centimeters higher, so it could be fastened in a vertical position. It had the image of a sword, a bow, a satchel for its storage, a combat belt, and a knife or bar sharpener. But the most important thing in our stela is the bowl writing. The Greek philosopher Herodotus described such bowls. Stela is more than 2,500 years old, and it belonged to the Iranian group of people of the Indo-European family, who were called Scythians. We don't even call it a Scythian stela, but it is the people that call it a Scythian woman. For example, this stone sculpture is absolutely beautiful. What is the purpose of these ancient sculptures? Why did a Russian museum take interest in an invaluable artifact of Ukraine, and how could it be protected? In 1955, in the village of Ternivka near Mykolayiv, an old building was demolished. When the owners of the manor dismantled the ruined building, school children playing nearby paid attention to one of the stones that was lying behind the building. The children were attracted by some strange drawings on a limestone slab. They told the teacher what they discovered, who then informed the staff about our museum. The item was donated by the owners, transported to the museum, and thoroughly cleaned of contamination. Then the restoration was carried out because the stela was split into 2 parts. After the process of washing the stela was completed, the next stage was a scientific study. The opinion of a specialist was necessary. At the same time, an archaeological expedition of the Moscow State University worked on the territory of Mykolayiv region. Researchers compared the discovery with materials that were earlier published in scientific literature and artifacts from other museums. They drew some impressive conclusions. The find that was for many years foundation for a farmhouse was nothing more than a 5th century BC Scythian stela. These are very interesting things. This is a beautiful stone sculpture. You can see a beautifully painted facial image on it. Very often, there are warriors holding a triton in their hands.
Воїни, які тримають ритон. Це найчастіший такий.
This image is called Baba, which means a woman, but in a male image.
Це всі чоловіки.
Scythian women are angels and demons of modern Scythology. By the way, they told a lot of things to scientists about Scythians and helped to unravel many mysteries of Scythian times. Researchers have not yet unraveled the mystery as to who exactly is depicted on these ancient artifacts, but how the ancient Scythians used them is no longer a secret for most scientists.
Скульптура ця скіфська.
As a rule, these Scythian sculptures are put on mounds, but not the largest ones.
Дехто вважає, що
Someone may think that this is the image of a glorified dead man, while others think, at first glance, that this is the image of Kolokos, the sun god, or a Scythian primary consciousness.
скажімо так, скіфського першопредка.
Similar monuments could have been fixed both in an upright position and on the outer surface of the mound.
Дуже
There are very interesting collections.
колекції.
There is a fantastic collection of these Scythian images and Scythian sculptures in the Donetsk Museum in the Dnipro Museum.
Скіфської скульптури в Донецькому музеї, потім дуже хороша в Дніпропетровському.
In our archaeological museum in Kiev, there are well-preserved Scythian images that were discovered in Mykolayiv region somewhere in the 5th century BC.
З Миколаївської області, з Нововасилівки, наприклад, 5 століття до нашої ери.
The limestone is a characteristic material on the territory of our region, but Scythian stelas that were made from another material have also been found here. In the museum collection at the open lapidary place, there is a stela that was made of local pink granite. Earlier, objects in open spaces were over time not as well preserved. In addition to that, the reliefs on granite tiles were not as distinct. For this reason, it is much more difficult to identify these attributes. It was a precise pattern of those times, which allowed to make the historical discovery. This was the bell writing described by Herodotus. He wrote that the Scythians had a ritual of fraternization. This is characteristic of the period when the Scythians went headstrong into battle. If there was no blood relative of a warrior, a son, a brother, or a father, then wine was poured into the bowl on a sharp object. Perhaps it was an arrowhead. In Scythian arrows, the tips were trihedral bronze, punctured on the finger of a third warrior. These drops of blood were combined with wine. Sipping such wine with blood, Scythian warriors believed they were attached to the rite of fraternization. This obliged them to help each other in peacetime and in wartime. In addition to self-identification, the Scythian stela contributed to the defining of certain specific features in traditions and the aiming of powerful people, who even managed to defeat the invincible Persians. It was during this period when a sword was considered a characteristic weapon, which is presented in the exhibition. The same kind of writings. This is an illustration of Herodotus about the life and military traditions of the Scythians. How did such an invaluable artifact turn out to be in such an unsightly position in the barnyard? This story began in the early years of the 20th century. As legend has it, at the beginning of the 20th century, this stela was removed from the ancient burial mound. It was used as a building material in the hall of the barnyard, and perhaps the scientific community or museum visitors would never see this unique artifact if the barnyard was not in total disrepair. For the Mykolayiv Museum, this story about the stela could have ended as sadly as it began. Indeed, in the late 1950s, the threat of losing this artifact was quite real, and all this was due to its popularity. The fact is that in the second issue of the Soviet Archaeology Journal, issued in 1959, the researcher Elahina published this stela with drawings with some similar analogies. This was the reason to organize an exhibition, and the Hermitage proposed to move it to a permanent storage place. This was not the only artifact taken to the Hermitage. It was during the time of the Russian Empire that all beautiful objects and all archaeological findings deserved special attention. Scythian objects, for example, were earlier transported to this outstanding museum. In the Hermitage, there was such a special storage room to which ancient Scythian objects and other precious artifacts were brought. As one archaeologist wrote, this was a generally accepted tradition. The Hermitage, together with its director, received a decisive rebuff in the middle of the 1950s. In 1954, there was a Scythian mound in which valuable ancient artifacts were found in the city of Melitopol. At the time, the curator of the Hermitage, Mikhailo Artemonov, was very impatient when the Scythian artifacts found in the Melitopol barrow were being transferred to Petersburg. But the young Ukrainian scientist Ivan Shevkoplas attempted to protect the Ukrainian artifacts in Ukrainian history. 5 years later, the curator of the Hermitage made a serious attempt to get a hold of these artifacts to preserve them in the Petersburg Museum. This was high time for Mykolayiv to put all efforts to preserve its cultural heritage. In 1955, a local historian, archaeologist Feodosy Kamensky worked in our museum. He did a lot for the development of regional archaeology. He was a member of the Olbia expedition to study the Greek city of Olbia and rural settlements. He discovered very many settlements in rural areas, and in order for the local history museum to have an archaeological section, he defended his position by making appeals to the local press and to representatives of the intelligentsia. In Mykolayiv, the interest of the local people experienced a boom. Even those people who were not interested in archaeology began to defend their heritage. Being under such pressure, the Hermitage was forced back down. For the collection of this largest museum of the time in Russia, an absolutely exact plaster copy was made. The original is still an ornament of our regional museum. This was probably the right thing to do. Our steppe kurgans allowed us to open up the pages of the history of the Scythian people. The stela was eventually presented at an exhibition in Petersburg. But that was the final cut for the Hermitage, and the curator had no choice but to be satisfied with having a plaster copy of this relic. When it was transferred to the vaults, researchers who, for one reason or another, could not work with the collection of our museum got the opportunity to obtain information about Scythian plastics. But the imperial predatory habits of Russia were still alive and well, and even after many decades, the greedy hands of Moscow continued to get a grasp of not only Scythian artifacts, but others. They are actively promoting the theme of Scythian gold. Indeed, an exhibition that was held in Amsterdam was given the title Crimea, the Golden Island in the Black Sea. This is a huge collection of Crimean gold, which since 2013 has been formed from several Kiev and Crimean museums, and it was presented to the EU. After the annexation of Crimea, Moscow laid its evil eyes on Ukrainian cultural values. Even Russians living abroad took interest. They attempted to bring Scythian gold to the Hermitage, but a number of Ukrainian ministries harshly responded to such insolence. In particular, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Information Policy, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ukraine as a state filed a lawsuit that this collection, which is the legitimate property of Ukraine, must be returned to Ukraine. In turn, Russia filed claims and is actively financing lawyers there and argues that the collection of Crimean museums is the property of the so-called people of Crimea and should be returned to the Russian Federation. In December 2016, the court passed down a ruling in favor of Ukraine. According to international documents, Crimea is an occupied territory, and all its values are the property of Ukraine. But the Russian Federation appealed the decision. Therefore, Scythian gold, which belongs to Ukraine, has not yet been returned to our country. In this dispute, Ukraine should justify its rights just the way it was done more than half a century ago. Meanwhile, the Scythian stela continues to amaze the visitors of one of the best museums in Ukraine.